What's up, Gromies? Welcome to Arroyo Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm your moderator, Kaisha. We are on episode 113. Shout out to our live viewers on YouTube and Instagram, and to everyone tapping in on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much for your support. And if you like the pod, please do drop us a review. We appreciate the feedback. Seth and Jason in the house. Gentlemen, how are you?
Doing all right. How are you?
Doing good. Yeah. It looks to me like you're ready to go. Oh, let's do it. This question came from Aaron. He writes, hey, following up, just hitting week 4 of flower, going into bulk. I've since adjusted the amount of runoff I've been pushing to help keep root zone pH in range. It seems to have worked so far, although switching to a 3.5 to 3.0 EC for one strain and a 2.8 for the other doesn't seem to have an impact on the output pH. How many days would you expect to run a higher input feed before seeing a change in output pH, given the drybacks and room parameters always remain consistent? I've noticed my VPD does swing about 0.2 kPAs every 20 minutes, night and day. Could this be causing some issues? I've also diverted my cold air coming in away from the canopy and lights because I noticed it causes a massive swing in leaf temperature when it kicks on, about 10 degrees Fahrenheit every time. Thoughts on that kind of effect? Thanks a ton for always helping.
Let's see. How long would we expect it to help with pH? I mean, if we're adjusting our runoff and we are giving the plants enough feed, I would hope to see it start to rise within maybe 3 to 5 days. If your pH was too low in that case, if not, then you might have to push even more runoff as long as you keep your EC in check. But it's going to depend a little bit on media size. And obviously, you've already recognized that certain strains are eating different amounts. So that can have a play, as well as how quickly they stabilize with the nutrient balance.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most frustrating things about trying to correct that pH is it does take time because we're not putting necessarily a huge volume of water compared to how much is in the block already. So every day that we're pushing a little more runoff, trying to run a correction, we're not necessarily able to, completely replace the volume of water and correct it in one day. So 3 to 5 days, I think, I agree with Jason, is about right where we'll see some pretty good correction. And then a lot of times we can back it off from a 3.5 down to a 3.0. But if you do back it down to a 3.0 and we're still seeing that pH drift down regularly day to day, that might be a sign that, hey, we're still not able to build EC and the pH is dropping. We might need to run a 3.5 early on for that particular strain because it tends to feed very aggressively under, for instance, a really high light environment.
Yeah, and if it's an ongoing problem that you can't find a solution to, there's kind of one sure bet way to figure out which cations or anions is both the plant taking up fastest. And a good way to do that is, well, there's 2 reasonable ways to do that. The best way is leaf tissue analysis, and that's going to give you an idea of what's in there. Another is to do some water samples, let's say of your feed nutrition and then of your runoff, and see, all right, of all of my independent nutrients in solution, which ones is the plant taking the most percentage out of my feed nutrition?
Yeah, and one nice thing about that is we can really categorize it. A lot of times into like two categories. We've got nitrogen and then our micronutrients and our PK. And usually if we're seeing a low EC state in the root zone in plants in weeks 1 through 3 or 4, when we're trying to run generative, when these plants are feeding really heavily, if we're not seeing that EC rise up and we're still only pushing, let's say 5 to 10% of total irrigation volume runoff, one thing that tells us is that plant is taking up a lot of nutrients. We know it's taking up large amounts of nitrogen to grow. So that's why when we got a plant, let's say between 3 and 4 EC in the root zone under high intensity LEDs, really quickly, if there's any kind of pH dip or nutritional deficiency, one of the first things we'll see is yellowing of the leaves. And a lot of times that's directly related to low nitrogen because we're already on the ragged edge of what those plants are trying to take up every day, even at a 3.0.
Yeah, and one of the cool things about nitrogen and or complicated things is we have both the nitrate forms and the ammonium nitrate forms, and obviously the straight nitrate form is immediately available to the plant, right? That's going to be what's taken up fastest. So that nitrate to ammonium balance is really important for plant health. And that's also a way that we can kind of help stabilize our pH is by changing that ratio.
Awesome. All right. Well, to our Grow Me, Aaron, you got some great tips there. Good luck. Thank you for following up and let us know. Come back and let us know how it's going. Awesome. All right. We're going to keep going. Our Grow Me Nick wrote in a question. He writes, I have a small cue for today. Again, on from last week's question. This is more of a massive thank you to Seth and Jason. The amount of light bulb moments they've delivered unto me has been immense. Most have ended up costing me more money. Realizing my creative Hugo was a mistake, but now have uni slabs en route. So much better to realize these issues before the run started than at week six flower and having to apply P3 shots. Thank you so much. But where would the best positioning be for a sensor on a unislab or GR40 uniblock? Thank you. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah. So hopefully, Nick, you've got installation template tool from Arroyo. We specify some of the specific heights for different medias on that block. I think the lowest one's at 1.25 inches. The next one's at 2 inches, if I remember correctly. And I think unislabs are still going to be that bottom 1.25 inch slot.
Yeah. Same for the unislabs and GR40s. We're on that 1.25 inch. Try to center it up on the block, not necessarily have it too far off to one side. And I think one of our best practice, little tips is to always have it on the same side of the block in respect to where the drain is on the table. So if you're looking at the table, uphill sides to your left, downhill sides to your right, make sure they're all on preferably the downhill side. The uphill side's okay. But making sure they're all on the same side can be very, very important as well, just so we don't see, an unintended coupled percentage shift because we have actually a lot of gradient on one table versus another.
That actually kind of brings up a great point, and that is just the importance of some of the inconsistencies, staying consistent with as much as you can do in that room, whether it's plant spacing, drip replacement. I've seen differences just from drip replacement, and any of that stuff that you can do and teach your staff to just stay with the same process, the same routine, a lot of times can avoid some inconsistencies or troubleshooting that might have to happen. May not be obvious. You end up troubleshooting something else when it's just a simple process that you have to stick with.
Yeah, one thing we've talked about on here and that I definitely spend plenty of time talking to clients about is hey, we moved a bunch of plants into a room to flower. 3 weeks in, the plants that we actually have sensors in might not be the most representative of the entire crop, right? We've got either a really small or a really big plant. And it's important to go adjust and try to get a more representative plant if you're trying to water to the average of the table, right? But that doesn't exclude the issue that this plant did happen to be smaller or larger. And that's a big part of not just crop steering, but really improving your little farm and grow in general is figuring out hey, why do we have this inconsistency? If the inconsistency was that the plants were different size coming out of veg, well, let's look back at veg and ultimately usually back to moms and see what we can do to really increase that consistency throughout that process. And then if the other end is, hey, this one slab sits in a puddle at one end of the table. Okay, well, if I've got, 10 or 12 plants affected by that, how much money am I going to spend shimming or playing with that end of the table to actually try to get it correct and deal with it? Because at the end of the day, if I found an inconsistency, I found an inconsistency, and that is costing me grams out of the room.
And you brought up a really good point there, and that is opportunity cost. At what point do we chase perfection so hard that it's costing us more than just accepting some of the issues with uniformity? Working with a biological product, and especially in larger facilities, we kind of just have to have a target point of happiness where it's this is doing the best we can. We're achieving a pretty tight margin of error, and anything that we strive to do for that is better, at least as far as uniformity goes, might be not worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have to operate in our limitations and constraints, right? For some people growing, that is physical limitations within the facility, whether it be power, running out of square footage, out of height, out of physical room to add more HVAC to the facility. There's a lot of things you can run into there. And then, that's even outside of just licensing limitations. Let's say the business is trying to scale, and at the price that you have to pay for either the land that you hopefully already own, but most cases we're looking at a lease or maybe some kind of capital investment loan to make it all happen. If you run into a limitation, you've got to figure out how to make more money despite that limitation, because some of those limitations aren't going to be solved today or tomorrow or even next year. And as a business owner or operator, you've got to be able to do something today and tomorrow to start making those changes happen and, correcting your revenue trajectory. I mean, if you're operating a business that isn't positive and you don't foresee anything positive until long after you're about to run out of money, well, you're not in a good spot.
So you don't want to run out of money first?
Ideally, no.
Okay.
Yeah. So, that's why I was talking about, responsibly scaling it, especially because this is volatile. Now we have so many examples of state after state after state. And even, now that we're seeing more countries come online, it's kind of predictable, right? We see a pretty big burst into the market with a lot of people opening up new businesses, spending a lot of money, getting things set up. And then in a year or two, we see kind of the market stabilize a little bit and figure out how much cannabis is going to be able to be sold in that particular market and how much opportunity there is for different business owners.
That's it, y'all. Progress, not perfection, right? Our Grammy Nick responded, brilliant as always. Sensors in middle and on the low, all on same side. Bingo. Thank you. Thank you for your question. We appreciate you. All right, going to keep it moving. We got this question for someone who writes that they are a longtime listener, first time writing in with a question. My feed EC is 1.8 and 5.8 pH, but my runoff is 4.8 pH, and the EC is so high that it flashes the maximum on my HANA pH probe. How do I reset it? 1 gallon Floraflex 60% mesh bag. I feed to runoff every day. What do you guys think?
Probably just going to have to push more runoff. And that would be the first thing that I would start with. And then likely end up actually having a higher EC so that your pH can stabilize. So, when we're thinking about what's causing this pH to be low, well, at 1.8 EC, there's a likeliness. Obviously, I don't have enough details to know for sure, but there's a likeliness that we're just running into an unbalance of cations and anions. So the plant's eating up more of a specific nutrient than is available. And so when you're getting just to runoff, which when everything else is ideal, that's what I like to do. But if we have some issues, then obviously we need to push a little bit more runoff to try and rebalance those cations and anions. Obviously, if your runoff is extremely high already, then there's a good chance that you've built up an imbalance of salts in the substrate. So if we push some more higher amounts of runoff, so if you say you're at 5% irrigation volume for your runoff right now, let's jump that up to like 20%, 30%, and see if we can't get your reset, as you're talking about, start to actually push that imbalanced salts out of the block. And then let's very likely increase our EC levels so that we don't run into that buildup of imbalance again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good time to talk about why, despite the fact that there's several different commercial, home level, boutique level, whatever you want to label any nutrient company or line as, base EC levels tend to run into the range of like 2.6 to 3.0. And part of the reason for that is that's a range that at the absolute worst case scenario on the side of you overwatering, let's say you were running a 50-50 cocoa perlite mix and you were running 100% of your irrigation volume as runoff every day, that 3.0 would ensure that your plants have absolutely adequate nutrition and that your pH is going to be in range every day. And then on the opposite end of that, if you tend to underwater, hopefully that's enough to keep your pH in range if you are able to push runoff somewhat regularly and have good success. So when you look at, like, let's say older feed schedules, particularly in the 10 plus year old range, we weren't seeing facilities that were pushing nearly as high a PPFD and CO2 levels. And although some people were back then, on average, when we're talking about trying to help someone crop steer or just in general provide plant nutrition without insight into the root zone, we're always going to settle on a value and a habit that leans way more towards maintaining pH and not letting EC get too out of control, which is usually pushing a little more runoff than not. So right back to what Jason said, that higher EC is going to help maintain pH. And that's probably your simplest solution right now to fixing that problem in just a few days.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe I should share my screen here. One of the resources or really interesting articles that I read early in my cultivation career was Justice von Liebig's Law of Minimum. I guess this was published back in 1873, supposedly. And I can just share my screen of, ironically, a post from a forum. Probably not my most favorite place to get information, but
this is a good illustration, though. Visually, when you're thinking of a holistic approach to plant growth, crop steering in general is just a fancy way to say optimizing every single input you possibly can to maximize your output.
Yep. And sometimes optimizing means we need more of it. So if we're running into an imbalance where, one of our anions or cations, let's just say we're running out of, potassium or phosphorus.
I was going to say calcium, I think, is probably the most common one that we run into when trying to crank up nutrient levels.
Yeah. It's going to cost us more by saving nutrients than it is by supplying enough. So if we have our calcium at too low of level, maybe I can get my pen out. We're going to get real fancy today and let's say our calcium's way down here. Right? If we're running out of that because the plant's taking up more than it can, it doesn't, all the investment that we have in light, in labor, in rent, in the other nutrients that we're supplying is now all going to waste, right? Yep. Because these plants are just going to grow to the best they can based on a limiting factor. And the better we can match those limiting factors, the better that our cost is going to come out to be in profit. Right. So that means less waste, and we can match our limiting variables all to about the same level of consumption. One of the kind of cool things here that you can expand on from this is also thinking about these not just necessarily as plant factors, but also analyzing your business on inputs as far as costs and usage and labor, all that type of stuff. You could basically change what those staves on the barrel look like and make an analysis that way.
Yeah, and there's in the nutrient example, we're using just basic EC and basic plant nutrition as a limiting factor here. But yeah, if we've got calcium, for instance, that's an issue. You're probably going to want to investigate, get some leaf tissue analysis, and figure out, okay, is it a lack of calcium input? Is it a lack of delivery post input? What's going on there? And then also evaluate certain things. We spend a lot of time talking to people about, for instance, lowering plant count because, hey, we're out of HVAC in the room. You've got plenty of light, but you don't have enough dehumidification or AC capacity for the number of lights that you have in there. So in some cases, it's sadly more cost effective to not plant a bench, turn off a row of lights, and then grow better product in a more efficient way inside a smaller portion of the room and not spend money on the rest of the room until you can make those HVAC upgrades, because you're frequently not going to see an increase in yield, whether that row of lights is on or off, if you have dehumidification, AC, or for instance, CO2 as a limitation. So I think it's important for operators, owners, really anyone involved that's trying to push yield and quality to understand, hey, we do have limitations and that there is always a trade-off in trying to manipulate for, let's say, yield or quality in light of those limitations. Just with that example that Jason showed, if all the staves in our barrel are built all the way up, we can push both yield and quality in a lot of strains. However, if there's a shortcoming, there's really no steering around it. It's often a limiting factor to everything else that we're inputting. And sometimes it's actually better to back off on energy, on fertilizer, on everything else if you have some of those limitations, and try to make money inside of the little box that's built for you.
Yep. Trade-offs are part of it. To our first time question submitter. Thank you so much for that question. Welcome to the show. Appreciate you. All right, we are getting some live questions here over on YouTube, so I'm going to focus on those for a moment. Tell Me in the Trees dropped this one. They wrote, flowering in the bedroom for 7 days before transferring to the flower room. Bedroom has 8 by 315 watt CMH lamps, and flower room has 20 by 720 watt LED lamps. What percentage would you start the LEDs given we are already on day 7 of 12/12 in the bedroom? Thanks, Arroya.
Yeah. So to start off with, one of the things that you're really going to want to do is take some actual light measurements at what your percentages are. Different manufacturers have different percentages, and one really important thing to think about when we're talking about percentages on LEDs, a lot of times that's actually the percentage of wattage or power that the drivers are pushing to the LEDs, not necessarily the actual percentage of total output of the light. So go in there. Take a par meter and get some actual PPFD readings of what your different percentages equal, and do that also for your CMHs. Obviously, we want to do this at plant height in the canopy so that we get an idea, all right, what's the plant feeling? And for flower, sure, that's going to be dynamic. For veg, shouldn't be too big a difference across the growth range there. But our general rule, since we're going from an 18-hour to a 12-hour light cycle, we want to match the DLI. So daily lighting integral is a count of the total number of photons that's hitting a specific area over a photo period. And so when we think about, all right, this plant's growing using that energy from these photons, when we transfer from veg to flower, we want to make sure it's getting at least the same amount of energy as it was, right? And since we have 6 hours less of photons hitting, we know we have to hit about 33% higher PPFD, right? So if you're seeing, say, 500 micromoles in your bedroom at plant height, go to your flower room and try and set your LEDs to whatever percentage is going to get you at that 700-800 range.
Yep, that's the key, honestly, is establishing that. And especially if you have CMHs, really figuring that out, because not only do LEDs not ramp linearly based on wattage input versus light output, no lighting does. So based on height and where you have those CMHs set, you really, really want to get an accurate idea of what those are putting out. New school trick, not old school trick, that I've seen a lot of people have great success with, is eventually upgrading the CMHs to the same LEDs that you run in your flower room. That way, bare minimum tech, you can go 1-to-1 on intensity when you move them from one room to the other. And then just as Jason said, you can crank them up about 30 to 33%. So if you're able to get it up to 550 in veg, you can happily come in at 700 to 800 in flower comfortably. But if you don't have those numbers, it's definitely better to play it on the safe side rather than pushing the far end of it and actually having to, slow down your flower cycle because you had to not turn the lights up for as long because you might have been getting some leaf burn or yellowing.
Yeah, and kind of an interesting side effect. I love CMHs and veg. I like HPSs and LEDs and flower. I like LEDs and veg. Is when we are changing light sources, we are going to have some change in our spectrum, our light spectrum. Really regardless of how hard we try to match that, there's usually going to be some change, especially if we're using a completely different light type. Even across the board with LEDs now, from manufacturer to manufacturer, there's drastically different spectrums that are available, and that's also going to change your plant morphology, right? And so, kind of just as a baseline, is let's try and achieve these PPFDs when we move it from one light source to the other. There might be some other side effects as far as your plant morphology goes, so you're gonna have to tweak it a little bit after you have that baseline set.
Amazing. All right, Tommy in the trees. Thank you so much for your question. All right, we're going to keep moving. More YouTube. Dan wrote in, hi guys. Do you think molasses could have any benefit at any point of the plant's life used in combination with salts at 3.0 EC?
So usually where we see molasses come into play is when we've got, it would be labeled as a living soil situation, right? We've got a well built up soilless mix with a combination of different organic compounds that are breaking down over time to become more plant bioavailable. and also a carbon source in there to host some fungi and bacteria that's going to help along with that process. Usually when we're looking at using molasses, it's more of a not always straight compost tea situation, but oftentimes included into that. And what's going on is we're feeding a lot of that bacteria and fungi inside the substrate with sugar to keep it alive and give it the energy it needs in order to help drive those symbiotic reactions that are helping provide our plants with potassium, phosphorus, nitrogen, and everything else they need to stay happy.
So in most inorganic hydroponic situations where we're using synthetic nutrients, i.e. either blended salts or powdered salts as our main nutrient, molasses is probably not one of the routes that you want to go.
Yeah, in fact, if you're not using it in a living soil application, it's actually probably asking for a little more trouble than it's worth, just because it is a sticky sugar that can contribute to clogging up your irrigation system, be difficult to get out of there. And then once it is inside your irrigation system, that's prime food for bacteria and fungi that'll form that nice biofilm that cleans up or plugs up all of our injectors or not our injectors, our emitters.
I love that question. Dan, you heard it. Good luck. Thank you so much for submitting it. All right, moving on. We got this question from Aaron. They're looking for an optimal range for VPD swings if you absolutely can't keep it from swinging to some degree, as in how frequent and how many KPAs. What kind of guidance can we give to Aaron here?
Well, optimal would be no swings ever. I think this rolls back to what we were talking about earlier as far as doing the best you can, right? Aaron's basically asking, okay, well, if we were looking at someone's data, what would we be like? Okay, that's probably not a problem. I think that's really what he's getting at here. 0.2, 0.3 every hour, 0.2 every hour might be kind of where I start to get a little bit worried, see if we can't stabilize it a little bit. And it kind of comes down to plant response, right? The plant's not going to instantaneously respond to this. So if we had smaller changes, but even faster, that's going to be about the same as bigger changes, but way slower. So yeah, I don't know that I can give great exact numbers on that, but maybe that's I was looking at it.
I think there's some basic rules, like for instance, if you could keep it inside of a 0.1 deadband and it was changing every 4 minutes all the time, constantly, that would be great. Even compared to changing, every half hour inside of that 0.1 deadband is kind of what Jason's going at. There's not a precise way as long as that deadband's narrow. Now, when that deadband is really, really wide, let's say it's a 0.5 kPa deadband that we're going to every 20 minutes, that's hitting a point where that's protracted long enough, the plant's trying to respond, and we might see some detriment in total transpiration to running it that wide that frequently. So in general, we're trying to keep it inside of about a 0.2 deadband, especially because there's so many different configurations of systems. We might see that 0.2 happen over every hour, every 10 minutes. Tough to say based on lighting, HVAC, etc. And overall, we just really want to minimize the extremes and then establish some basic rules. So once we start going above, 1.5, 1.6, we're kind of past the point of diminishing returns on what dehumidification is doing for us, right? We're not getting any more transpiration. In fact, it's going to start to go the other way as it's getting too dry for the plant. If we go under, 1.2 to 1.4, that range, we're starting to see a decrease in transpiration. And then once we go below 1.0, especially in late flower, not only seeing a decrease in transpiration, but also potential for mold and other pathogens to pop up. So basic outlines, and then how much control do you have and how can you slow those changes down to make them as gentle as possible for the plant, but also stay inside of your goals.
Love that, Aaron. That's a great question. Thank you so much. And actually, it segues perfectly into our next one. This one came from Dr. Ropotnik. Thank you so much for letting me say that. I'm dying to say it. They write, so I have a question about mold. They say mold can start to form around 70% humidity, but according to certain VPD charts, you can have your humidity over 70 as long as your temp is high enough. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, fortunately enough, when we are trying to run humidities over 70%, it's pretty early in the plant life cycle. And what happens is these younger plants are actually more resistant to mold and mildew growth. A lot of times molds and mildews, they're going to be targeting in weaker plant areas, plant material that's dying, that doesn't have the robust cells to deter that target area of mold and mildew. So most of the time when we are up above 70%, we're pretty young. We've got good airflow through the canopy. We don't have those super dense bud sites that are harboring localized humidity areas. And so, sure, I always recommend running up in that 70% range early on in the cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good, it's a visual demonstrator of what VPD can do for your plants and how it also affects things like fungi. So if we're running below 70 degrees, that, which we're never doing in early flower when we're above 70% humidity, below 70 degrees is also where things like aspergillus and botrytis proliferate the most. They grow very happily in between 60 and 70 degrees and above 70% humidity, even above 60% humidity. However, as we go above 70 degrees, those molds don't grow as well. And part of that is because of VPD. So it's a little tougher for them to get access to water, and they just don't grow as well at, let's say, 75 or 80 degrees. So that is one of the things that when we, Jason and I talk to someone who, let's say, is in week 6, 7, we're just starting to talk to you, we get sensors in and we're saying, hey, you're hitting, 0.6 VPD overnight, trying to go down to this 63 degrees. Let's try to just, first lever we're going to pull, raise that temperature up to like 67, 68. Let's see if that's going to raise that VPD up closer to a 1.0 for us. Then we might raise it all the way up to 70, 71 overnight just to correct that VPD. But we know by correcting that VPD to over a 1.0, we're reducing the chance of crossing a dew point and getting rain on the product. And then also, because we're not getting rain, much less chance that there's going to be mold or any chance of mold growth in there. And, if we've already identified we've got a room that's overpacked with biomass compared to what our HVAC system we can do, I think most of us would agree that we'd rather not harvest 10 to 30% of our crop as mold and throw it away, and would rather have, maybe some less purple bud. And now we know that we just can't pack that room as much next time if we want to be able to get that deep purple or particular finish on a certain strain.
That's a great overview, guys. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Dr. Robotnik. Come back anytime. All right, we're going to move over to Instagram. I got some live questions over there. This one comes from Mr. Beans and Clones. They want to know, when do you know when to stop feeding and spacing between feeding? Hand water, by the way. What do you guys think?
So like if I'm applying a feed, once I get runoff, that's when I'm going to stop that particular shot. Especially if you're in a 2 or 3 gallon pot, you're getting good saturation. Hopefully you have a wand that's putting it on slowly. And that's going to kind of be the hand feel metric there. Make sure you can actually get a good idea of when water runs out the bottom of that pot, so you're not sitting there an extra 30 seconds flushing it out. And then in the afternoon, probably take a cup, take your watering wand, and see how long it takes to fill up that one little cup. If you've got, let's say, a 2 gallon pot, it might just be a 3 count that you put on each plant to accomplish a P2, and then space those out about every hour and a half, 2 hours. That's going to be about as fancy as you want to get without driving yourself crazy.
Gotcha. Yeah. Sorry, I was thinking about just feeding as far as nutrition, not necessarily as total fertigation. So
okay.
Love it.
Yeah, no, bam, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Beans and Clones. And then we got this perfect flip side question from Save Yourself Genetics, who writes, how often are you checking runoff if you're using media sensors? Do you suggest inline sensors for runoff? Thanks.
Inline sensors they're a great way to catch runoff, as long as logistically in your room you have a good way to do that. Typically I'll install them in a trap just to help keep from any salts building up on those electrodes that are monitoring your runoff EC. For pH, that's the one that I still really check when I've got root zone sensors. After, maybe a week or 2 of getting used to the readings from my root zone sensors, I personally don't take runoff readings for EC anymore. Still definitely on a daily basis, or at least a few times a week, making sure that that pH is in check for my runoff.
Yeah, I think I have the best success taking my runoff samples from plants that I actually have sensors installed into. So I can get a very direct correlation between what's going on in the root zone and what that runoff pH is. And just like Jason said, pretty quickly, I'll not really look at that runoff EC measurement too much unless it looks extremely low or high compared to what I see in the root zone. But I also think that's a great way to learn what you can expect and see when a plant is feeding or not feeding in terms of that relationship between EC building in the root zone and drop in pH consistently day to day, or not seeing a drop in pH day to day if you continue to run, let's say, 10% of your total irrigation volume as runoff.
Yeah, and kind of the reasons for this is most all of us are used to making adjustments based on runoff EC, right? This is how almost all of us started growing. It's kind of the first step to really understanding how your plants are feeding, first steps to doing some crop steering techniques. And once we have root zone data, we can have just a lot more data points, right? So my runoff EC, even if I had a lot of those, that would be like maybe 2 or 3 a day. Right. And that might give me a couple of points to get involved in as far as how can I manipulate the details of my irrigation schedule to make some improvements. Once you've moved to time series data with root zone sensors, you're looking at a reading every 3 minutes. Right. So now we go from a reading that is very, I guess, defined, if you will, into readings that are very detailed as far as the dynamics of what's going on with the root zone. You know, if we see data that is time series and it shows that the EC changes up when we're feeding, that's a lot more information than if the plant, if we get a runoff reading, we may not know, all right, before we fed, what was the EC in the plant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to get anywhere close, you'd still have to have point measurements with a substrate sensor, because we have no way, or go sample and take it back to a lab, do little tiny core samples all over your crop throughout, and then go analyze those in a lab. Otherwise, it's very tough because we're taking such a relative measurement by rinsing that substrate with a diluted solution to try to figure out what's going on inside of that. And it gives us zero visibility into the rest of the day.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Thank you for your questions. Save Yourself Genetics. Another great handle. So good. All right. We got a follow up to the question we asked earlier around the unislabs. And I think it may be from the same person. I'm not sure. But from last week and from past episodes, you clearly explained why Hugo blocks are not good for low plant density with high yields and achieving ripening drybacks. The reason I haven't gone slab is I can't work out a way of pH and EC testing runoff from individual slabs. And while I'm learning this new tech, I want to be super precise. In a few runs, I'll test whole tables, but my question related to the difference between the Grodan Unislab, which is around 4.6 liters volume, and the GR40 Uniblock being at 4 liters. From what I understand, the Unislab is vertical weave, while the GR40 block is horizontal weave. If this is the case, what would you choose and why for this particular application of 5.6 ounce plants, dry with good manageable ripening drybacks? Did you get all that, guys?
Yeah, I personally, I'd go with the slabs. It's what I've been really successful with is 4-inch blocks on slabs. For me, it's actually nice to share a root zone, because if I have an issue with a dripper, well, there's 5 other drippers in there to hang on to it. Botanicare used to have trays. I haven't seen them in a long time, but they used to have.
I'll let it out. It's called a Dutch leach tray.
There you go.
And quite a few companies make them, actually. You just don't see them as much in cannabis specific distributors out there. But they are designed to hold a 36-inch by 6-inch by 3-inch slab, or 4-inch, whatever you have. And you can space those up off the table just like any riser for a cocoa pot and pull your runoff out of one end of those. Botanicare does make one. I think they're over $30 at the moment. And you can get these Dutch leach trays down at like $8 if you look around at the right spot. They're more for commercial vegetable production, but they work just fine for our purposes. As far as the two options you're looking at for right now, At the GR40, we're looking at something that's got an open top and bottom, so we see a little bit more evaporation and not as good a water retention. Out in practice, I've seen a little bit better performance with the wrapped unislab, just having a little bit better water retention and ability to run generative late in flower. But if your runoff has been your biggest challenge, I really strongly suggest you look at those trays, because the other thing at that price point, like $8, I'll buy a bunch of them and throw them out there, because then I can still have people go around and actually lift up a plant. And if it happens to be a plant that has a sensor in it and they can say, hey, that's what 35% felt like, it just gives me better, quick visibility. And then at least people still have that option, right? Like, that is one of the things I find toughest about slabs, is if I tell someone like, hey, how did it look or feel? They're like, I don't know. I picked it up and it folded, just did this. And I'm like, ooh, yeah. Water it more, but if they can pick the whole thing up without damaging it, then they can at least tune their feel a little better, so that, although buying, twice the sensor density may not be in the cards, having more tools that are $8 a piece might be.
Yeah. Kind of interesting that you brought up that, picking it up. One thing to kind of keep in mind that I'm not sure we've ever even talked about is plants are going to keep getting heavier and heavier, right? And so when we look at a lot of traditional ways of measuring water content in there, it's using load cells across a whole bench. Well, in order to effectively do that, you actually have to have a model of the crop weight in there, subtract that from the total weight. So you got to kind of keep that in mind as well. Is all right, well, how heavy would I expect 3 plants in a wet slab to be when the plants are smaller? Well, what's that weight look like when it's heavier? It's one of the major advantages of using a direct water content sensor, is it doesn't really care how big the plant is as far as giving you an accurate reading.
Yeah, absolutely. If I wanted to get that same info out of a load cell or trying to weigh it, I would have to correct to really only look at the difference every day and not ever the total weight, which, isn't horribly hard, but that's also not accounting for the actual growth of the mass of the plant. So not quite as accurate as just looking at what's in the root zone.
And also, just don't fold your slabs. The water's not consistency of or uniformity of the water content in there after that rock wool has been disturbed, if you will. I guess there's other ways to say that, but it's not as good as it is. Anytime if a block gets squished, like some people, interestingly enough, like to get their water content lower after they've saturated, they'll squeeze a block down. Not necessarily ideal. Yeah, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. If you're trying to reuse slabs that have damage to them, definitely expect some differences.
Yeah, even on a fully saturated Hugo, the weight of the water in that block, if you put your fingers on the bottom and pick it up, you can feel your fingertips crushing that pore space. And whether it's a Hugo, a slab, maybe a 4-inch is about the only thing that's not heavy enough to necessarily do that to a point where it's going to damage it. But yeah, if I pick up a slab and put a pretty big crease into it, I've definitely crushed a sizable percentage of pore space out of that, and also probably affected how water is going to wick back and forth along it. And the same can go even with those unislabs, just picking up from the bottom and crushing around the edges and creating unevenness that will lead to pooling or lack of drainage in certain spots.
There it is, y'all. We got some slab SOPs on the episode. Fantastic. Thank you, guys. All right. Moving on to this question on Instagram from Mr. Big Blunts. They want to know, is it better to use peristaltic pumps or Dosatrons when designing a new irrigation system to pair with Arroyo?
I don't know that there's one that's better than the other. There's advantages and disadvantages to both of them. Dosatron advantages are, over the high quality peristaltic pumps, which you definitely want to be using. Don't use the $12 ones off Amazon that I play with sometimes. So Dosatrons most of the time are going to be a little bit less expensive than a high quality peristaltic. The Dosatrons historically have been pretty reliable. They're very, very common. It's a great way to fill up a batch tank, especially. The nice thing about peristaltics is that you have a lot higher ability of adjustment, right? Sometimes they have a little bit higher maintenance cost for replacing the silicone tubing inside. And then obviously, setup is going to be a little bit more complicated, having a controller for the peristaltics. So kind of comes down to what are you trying to do, right? If we're manipulating one of the components of our feed on a regular basis, a lot of times I'll have that on a peristaltic pump, right? And the reason there, let's say we have some fluctuations in the pH of our well water. Well, if I've got a feedback loop with my pH sensor, I can have that on some pH adjustment, either acid or base, that keeps my batch tank at a specific pH, regardless of what the input is. Whereas if we're using a Dosatron to do that same thing, it's just going to adjust it up or down, right? So that's kind of one of the advantages of peristaltic, because you can set them up on a full feedback, whereas Dosatrons you're gonna have to manually adjust that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on what you're doing. If you're filling a batch tank time and time again, a Dosatron is a great way to do that. Inline injection systems, Dosatrons are great for your A and B components. Something like pH, you're pretty much always going to be stuck with a P pump or some sort of other directly controlled and variable injector, because that's always going to be changing. And then I think one of the last considerations that you really need to look at is, what kind of flows are we going to get out of that? So if I've got a system that I want to fill 10 different 30-gallon batch tanks for 10 small rooms, that P pump's going to be a lot more advantageous to me, because I can change it digitally and quickly to cycle through those different tanks if they need different mix requirements. Now, if I'm trying to top each of those tanks off exactly the same, let's say I got 10 rooms, but they're bundled together and I'm harvesting them all at the same time, well, great. That Dosatron might be awesome to just have on a float valve and top those tanks off all day. But it really depends on the kind of precision we're looking for. And then, long term, understanding that no matter which you go with, whether it is a Dosatron system or a P pump based system, there is going to be maintenance. Anytime we look at Dosatrons, number one is like do a lot of research on your flow requirements to make sure you're actually going to be able to mix in the range that you want to, because even though a lot of us out there think we've got a pretty big weed grow, it turns out Dosatron makes some injectors that are incredibly massive, a lot higher water flow than any of us are putting out there, at least in indoor or greenhouse cannabis production. So making sure that size is very, very important. And then, like I said, understanding that, hey, whether it's a Dosatron or a P pump, you're going to need to have spares around, because we're still injecting chemicals that are corrosive over time to these systems. And it's not a matter of if, it's when they will fail. Every tool and piece of equipment we buy to grow cannabis with is not really, your real estate might be an investment, but the pumps, the tanks, the tables, all that stuff that you buy to go on there is not generally going to appreciate in value just by itself sitting there. It's going to go very quickly the other way, just the way it goes.
Love that. Thank you, guys. Shout out to Mr. Big Blunts. And by the way, if you're an Arroyo Core customer, crop consultation is included in that. So, if you're a customer, give us a call. Let's help you out. Okay. We're going to keep it moving. We got this question from David Hampton, 9297. They write, hi there. I've been listening through older office hours and looking for an idea of what a daily, weekly SOP on frequency of monitoring and how often you adjust based on those readings. Do you adjust after each read?
So I guess he's talked about looking at Arroyo.
Yeah, either looking at Arroyo, or if you're to, like, the other way I interpret that is if I could pick how many points in a day do I need to say I go to Solus reading. If I had 6 plants in a tent, right? Yeah.
I mean, for me, looking at Arroyo, it's going to depend on how many rooms that I'm running. So for one room, I'm probably going to look at it like 5 times a day, but I might be somewhat obsessive. So I'll definitely want to, look at some of my environmentals after lights on. Maybe we'll just start this cycle, I say after lights on. So looking at environmentals there, and at the same time, I'll be looking at what my EC and water content are doing, making sure that I don't need to make adjustments, or if I do need to make adjustments, how much to my irrigation. for the day. I might personally also check it again after my expected P1s, make sure that, I am getting enough to hit field capacity. I might be in the room looking at it, see if I get some runoff, just kind of take all those mental checks that everything is operating as it's expected. Yesterday, if I didn't have a lot of runoff and maybe I'm in week 1 or 2, and today I might not have runoff. Now I get an idea of how much that plant is growing, right? It's using more water than the amount of runoff I had yesterday. And so I know that I need to exceed that, plus how much more runoff that I want to. So it's a really good way to make some calculations for any irrigation adjustments, and environmental adjustments for that standpoint. And then again, looking after P2s, if I am in a vegetative type of status, just make sure that I maintain my water contents where I wanted them to be, get kind of an idea of what my expected drybacks are for the next day, and prep up for that cycle again. And then I always look at it before I go to bed.
Yeah. And then your validation points, I think that's the biggest thing. What are any plants too dry in the morning? Are they going to start wilting if you don't get in there and water them? That's always good. Did you hit your goals? And when you leave, does everything still look okay? Or do you need to put a little bit of water on them? Starting there. And then, like Jason said, 5 times a day. I would say a lot of people that start out with, either Roy Go or Core, just 24/7 monitoring. It's unfortunately you have access to it on your phone. So 5's like a real low number. And then usually, once you get comfortable calculating your irrigation volumes based on what you're seeing and start to get, I don't want to say everything's an intuitive feel, but you get into a habit, right? You know that, hey, if I add 20 more seconds of irrigation, I can expect to see the line go up X amount more. And you get comfortable with it and you trust it. And a few weeks into it, you're not necessarily looking at your phone 50 times a day. You're actually back down to 5 times a day. And just validating that, hey, I had a plan. I put the water on. It hit the number that I was looking for. My EC looks good. Continue on with my day.
Yeah, I really like the way that you said validated, because obviously, as a lot of us know, so my first experiences in cannabis were programming automation systems. And I did a lot of validating because I was learning how to make adjustments to controller programming. And so that would also be another time that you want to check it, is anytime that you make an adjustment. So make an adjustment and monitor after that to see how quickly the adjustment impacted the conditions in your room, and or if you need to increase your adjustments, a little bit more, a little bit less adjustment in order to hit the ideal targets.
Yeah. And I mean, when we're looking at especially irrigation in general, we always want to validate anything that can potentially be a variable. And by validate, I mean validate that it is what we planned on it being, whether that's feed volume. That's why we always talk about doing a drip cup test in between runs. Go see if you've got, more than 10, 20% variation across your room, because if so, it's going to be really hard to plan your irrigation when you don't know which emitters are what level of plugged out there, for instance. If we're looking at, feed EC, for instance, hey, right back to the Dosatron and P pump situation. If I've got, a 6-part solution that I'm trying to mix up and I don't have any validation at the bench, I might be kind of blind to when one of those injectors is partially plugging and I'm trying to put on a 3.5 feed, but I'm actually getting 2.6 or 1.8, whatever it may be. And if I don't have that validation, I don't know that that's the problem. And if I don't know it's the problem, that's a variable that I'm most likely going to assume is behaving the way that I expect it to. And if I assume that might throw out assumptions, or not assumptions, but certain analysis. Like, let's say, hey, my calcium nitrate injector has plugged up. I have some really weird looking plants going into week 2. Or, my part B solution plugged up. I don't have a lot of PK going in. I have some very weird looking plants in another way. But if I didn't know that injector was plugged up, I could probably chase a lot of different things, whether it's environment or, who knows.
This is why I very early on started using substrate sensors, was because I didn't really have any other way to directly monitor what the plant was doing, right? Most all of our readings that we're taking or monitoring in a facility are coming from something else, right? It's telling, hey, a piece of equipment's doing what a piece of equipment's doing. A person's doing what a person's supposed to be doing. the root zone sensor, it is directly related to what that plant is, right? Everything else in the facility readings wise could fail, and yet my root zone sensor is still going to tell me whether my plant's growing well or not.
Yep, we're big fans of substrate sensors around here. Love this conversation. Thank you so much for that question, David. Good luck. We did a quick little poll. We asked where everybody is listening from today: North America, Europe, South America, or Asia and Australia. And we've got 12% listeners coming in from Europe and 88% from North America. Wherever you are in the world, we're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for checking out our podcast. Please do spread the word. All right, we got like 5 minutes left. There's a couple more really great questions I have here. Someone wrote this in. Hey, so I've been listening for a little while, and in cocoa or rockwool, the EC rises as it dries and lowers as it's watered. But as I use my Blue Labs pulse meter in my living soil beds, it seems to be the opposite. As I water, EC rises, and as it dries, EC lowers. The question I have, is the EC being changed by the soil microbe eating and releasing available nutrients? And when it dries, are the nutrients locked up in the microbe as they die back or go into dormancy? Or am I missing something?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple complexities here. One would be, living soil is a much more dynamic beast when it comes to making assumptions based on the EC measurement in the substrate. Using EC it's extremely effective in organic salts, especially in organic medias. There can be some stuff coming into play that doesn't register necessarily on an EC meter. That being said, if we see EC rise when we irrigate, a lot of times it just means it depends on what our base EC is. If our EC is pretty low, let's say we're at an EC for organics, let's say we're at an EC of 1, we would expect it to rise when we irrigate, right? And that's kind of regardless of how much nutrition that we're adding to our fertigation system, simply because we're increasing the availability of those nutrients to the plant as we get some more water into that living soil. Seth's going to make us some art here.
It's not good art, but if you can imagine, this is very, very tiny.
Are these roots?
These are root hairs. Yeah.
Nice.
So my first question on that EC raising and lowering is number one, what your input EC is, even if you're feeding with straight well water. What does that look like going in? Because if you do have a sensor that's trying to measure that bulk EC, that's going to be measuring, especially right after watering, most closely what the EC in that is. And if you otherwise have no other salts in your media, it's going to go up every time you water with any amount of EC on it. When we're looking at what living soils do, as far as the rhizosphere is concerned, you can kind of see my little tiny blue roots there with the red lines. It's very, very scientific. But the area that these interactions occur, that a lot of these microbes are working for the plant, is like within a millimeter around that root. So when we stab that probe in, when that's measuring the pore water EC, that's not necessarily representative of what's going on in the tiny amount of water that's immediately around the root itself. And that's where that interaction that's providing nutrition to the plant's actually happening. So it is really interesting to see, over time, when we're looking at, like, let's say shoving one of our sensors into a living soil bed and watching it over a whole season, that increasing bioavailability. But when we're looking at a day-to-day view of what's going on, it's going to be much harder to capture with pore water EC, just because those interactions are happening on such a microscopic level right around the root hair itself.
Yeah, and this kind of brings up a physiological or a psychological difference between feeding in living soil and feeding in organic assault-based media or hydroponic media. And that is, when we are feeding in a hydroponic, we can always base our irrigations on feedback, right? What happened yesterday? How do I make changes today to impact that? When we're working with living soil, we have to have very good documentation of how much of what we fed when we fed it, because it's starting to be available to the plant on a breakdown timeline. So it might be something where we made a change in the substrate, or the soil in this case, because we're looking in living soil. We might have added a specific organic matter a month ago, and now we're just starting to see some of those nutrients available to the plant. So it's one of those things where we got to zoom way out, think of what the overall strategy is, and make some journal-based calculations on what we would expect to be available.
Yeah, like if we're just looking at nitrogen availability and mixing up a living soil about my nitrogen inputs, whether that's a certain type of manure or a different meal, I've got a breakdown time. When that starts to break down and become bioavailable, it's being accelerated by all the different lovely life inside of that soil. And then it's tapering off as all of that, wonderful bacteria and fungi runs out of food to then produce nitrate for the plant to eat up. And this curve is what we would capture long-term looking at EC in that substrate solution. But again, day to day, it's going to be very, very difficult. And it actually takes a lot of planning to time, when on that curve, we're actually putting our plant into that pot and taking advantage of the bioavailability of that release curve. And that's, it's a whole business in and of itself that people actually capitalize on and spend time making custom batches of soil to match people's ideal transplant dates and work with growers to optimize that. Ooh, Jason's got something fun here.
Yeah, so let's think about if we are trying to schedule this. Again, we have our nitrogen, but now we've actually an amendment schedule, right? So we're trying to basically levelize how much nitrogen is available to that plant, especially earlier on in the cycle, right? So we're going to have to time this so before our plants are even in that substrate, we've got that nitrogen bioavailable to the plant. So we need to make sure that, hey, we've really planned out our organic soil long before we've planted our plants. And then through there, if you start to get really good at organics, you're going to play with this. I mean, obviously not just with nitrogen, but we use nitrogen as this example. We could think about stopping amendments at the right time so that we start cutting amount of nitrogens towards the end of the cycle. And that's really what's going to start giving us the great flower that we want, is making sure our amendments are on a good timeline, the right nutrients are available to the plant at the right times.
Yeah, and I think that really is a good way to illustrate why running, a living soil system and being a commercial competitive cannabis producer are two very difficult things to make mesh currently. Because let's say you're a full-term outdoor grower growing in beds. This is one series of applications and one plan to follow throughout the year. Maybe slightly varied depending on certain strains and different planting dates. But running 20 of these plans concurrently at once in 20 different rooms is where that becomes extremely difficult to turn a profit commercially. However, we do see people out there having success in that market. Just so happens they're generally very, 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 very good at planning. Not as much of a spacey hippie as you'd expect from someone that wants to go all organic and talk about, worms and fun things like that all day.
Man, thank you guys for that breakdown. Love that question. Always a big fan of an overview and the whiteboard. Thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and wrap up, but I got to give some props to Gromies. Y'all really came through with some fantastic questions. We really appreciate you. The show is for you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Seth, Jason, and producer Chris for another great session. And thank you all for joining us for this week's Arroyo Office Hours. To learn more about Arroyo, book a demo at arroyo.io, and our team will show you the ins and outs of the ultimate cannabis cultivation platform. If you have any crop steering or cultivation questions you want us to cover, drop them anytime in the Arroyo app. Email us at sales@arroyo.io. Send us a DM on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We definitely want to hear from you. If you're a fan of the pod, please leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We appreciate your feedback, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you at episode 114. Bye.